collections, adaptations, derivatives, and remixes in the Creative Commons. First, a disclaimer. Determining the differences between collections, adaptations, derivatives, and remixes is one of the most complex aspects of the Creative Commons. There's a lot of subjectivity involved when applying those terms to individual cases with their unique attributes and characteristics. Even experts and legal professionals can sometimes disagree on interpretations. The legal definitions of those words can also vary from one country to another. So for the purposes of this presentation, we will primarily use interpretations based on United States copyright law. And to be clear, although the images used here to represent these terms are related to music, these terms apply to virtually all tangible mediums of expression. Essentially, anything that can be copyrighted can be subjected to rules related to collections, adaptations, derivative works, and remixes. And we will address each of these terms individually, especially as the title suggests in relation to the Creative Commons. First, when we use the term collection, we are referring to a work that combines multiple distinct and independent works into a single cohesive whole. These individual works within the collection maintain their separate identities and are not altered or transformed in significant ways, often not at all. Importantly, the person who creates this collection must have permission to use those works. This permission could come from owning the rights, obtaining consent from the original creators using public domain works, or using works available under a Creative Commons license. Let's say that two teachers, Jane Doe and Joe Smith, want to create an OE or anthology for a class on Gothic literature, and they would like to share that anthology in the Creative Commons. They consider including the following novels. They quickly realize that they cannot include The Haunting of Hill House, Rebecca, and Salem's Lot because they are too new and not in the public domain. Those works are still copyrighted, and the authors did not share them using a Creative Commons license. That leaves Jane and Joe 5 works that they can include in a collection of novels that are free from copyright restrictions. Then they decide that it would be useful to include a section that describes what the genre of Gothic literature actually is, something like a supplemental section of critical editions and scholarly anthologies. While searching for information, they come across two books: The Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, edited by Gerard Hogel, and A Guide to the Gothic, edited by John Nett Loreto. Both of these books have chapters that they think would be perfect for their collection. But they know that they must consider any potential copyright issues, so they turn to the copyright page of Hogel's Gothic Fiction to see what, if any, restrictions there might be. There they see that the Cambridge University Press has clearly copyrighted Hogel's book. This publication is in copyright, subject to statutory exceptions and to the provisions of relevant collective agreements. No reproduction of any part may take place without the written permission of Cambridge University Press. They know that one statutory exception would be fair use, meaning excerpts could be used, especially for educational purposes, but a collection meant for the Creative Commons sharing cannot incorporate entire chapters without obtaining the appropriate permissions or licensing from Cambridge University Press. Jane and Joe are teachers. They know that they could never afford that type of licensing agreement. But when they look closer at Loreto's Guide to the Gothic, they see that although the book was copyrighted in 2019, it is licensed with a Creative Commons attribution. They know enough about the Creative Commons to know that the little icon of the small person means that they must give the author credit if they want to use the book. But to remind themselves what they can and cannot do with the work, Jane and Joe click on the link that will take them to the licensing deed. A human-readable description of some of its key terms. Again, they already know that this icon stands for attribution, which means that they must give the original creator his or her attribution if the work is used. Jane and Joe also know enough about the Creative Commons to know that this means that they are free to include any of the chapters in their collection as long as they give Loreto credit. As they look through the book, they identify 3 chapters that they think would work particularly well in their collection. As they look closer at the chapters, they notice that they were written by individuals other than Loreto, so they make a note to make sure they include those authors' attributions as well. Jane and Joe feel comfortable including these chapters because they know about how much leeway a Creative Commons license can give them. Loreto's license does not include the more restrictive elements of Creative Commons licenses like non-commercial, share alike, or no derivatives. Jane and Joe have no plans to sell their collection anyway, so it would not have mattered much even if Laredo had used that restriction. If Laredo had licensed her work under an attribution share like licensed Jane, and Joe would have been required to do the same. However, they don't intend to impose any restrictions of their own, so again, this would not have affected their own license. If Laredo had licensed her work under an attribution no derivative license, that would have allowed users to adapt the work for their own personal use, but they could not share any adaptations publicly. This restriction would have affected Jane's and Joe's plans because they do want to share their work with others using their own license. Jane and Joe are happy that Laredo has none of the stricter restrictions because they want to make sure that they are using the work in a way that the original creator intended it to be used. That is why they are thankful for the licensing deed to help them remember what they can and cannot do with the work in the Creative Commons. When they read the licensing deed for a guide to the Gothic, they see that they have the ability to adapt the work. But what does it mean that users can adapt works in the Creative Commons? What does it mean when it says that you can remix, transform, and build upon the material? Are those words describing the same thing, or do they describe different types of ways to adapt the work? To adapt something means that you are simply creating an adaptation, right? Well, yes and no. Just because something is adapted does not mean that new work is necessarily an adaptation, at least not in terms of copyright law. It can be confusing, but Jane remembers that this was less confusing when she learned that the word derivative is a word often used by legal experts to identify what we mean when we say that a work has been sufficiently adapted enough to be a new, even copyrightable work in of itself. The United States Copyright Act defines a derivative as a work based upon one or more pre-existing works such as a translation, arrangement, dramatization, fictionalization, reproduction, or any other form in which a work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. To be clear, only the owner of the pre-existing work has the legal right to prepare a derivative work, either by doing so themselves or by explicitly giving someone else permission to do so. Without that permission, the unauthorized derivative work might constitute copyright infringement. Securing that permission can be complex, time-consuming, and expensive. Jane and Joe do not have the financial resources to secure the rights for including copyrighted works in their collection. Moreover, they want to ensure that their work is free for others to use. Including works that require payment would mean that others would likely need to pay for their own publishing rights. But the Creative Commons simplifies this process by providing a standardized way for creators to grant permission to create derivative works without the need for individual negotiations of permissions. So luckily for the would-be editors of the Gothic literature anthology, Laredo has essentially already given them permission to adapt her work, permission to not only include her chapters, but permission to adapt the work in any way they see fit, including creating a derivative work. One of the reasons why Jane and Joe liked the 3 chapters that they chose was because they liked the way that they focus on 3 distinct periods: the 18th century, the Victorian era, and the early 20th century. These are the 3 periods that they most often cover in their courses, so to emphasize that, they decide to change the titles to better reflect that emphasis. Obviously, simply changing the titles is not a major adaptation, but at the very least, Jane and Joe are more comfortable making even small changes because they know that they are perfectly within their rights to do so given the Creative Commons license attached to each chapter. As they continue researching potential sources, they come across an article on the British Library's website on Gothic motifs, written by John Bowen. And at the bottom of the page, they see that the article has a Creative Commons license that once again gives them permission to adapt the work. They like Bowen's succinct characterization of the genre and are considering including his article in their anthology. However, they don't believe the article's images are necessary for their purposes, and some of the works that Bowen discusses in great detail will probably not be included in their anthology. But before they decide to not use the article at all, Joe notes that one paragraph from the article does a nice job of describing Gothic motifs related to moments of transition. You don't need to actually read all of that. I mean, you could pause the video, but unless you're just really interested in the topic, it's not necessary for our purposes. So moving on. The point here is that it reminds Joe of a paragraph in Catherine Hawkins' chapter on Gothic in the early 20th century. Again, you don't need to read all of that. Just know it's there. Since Joe knows that they have the rights to adapt both of these works, he knows that this means that they have the right to remix the works as well. Within the context of Creative Commons licenses, remix means altering, merging, or enhancing existing works to produce a new derivative creation. In essence, it is an adaptation, but the term remix implies that multiple works have been blended together to craft a new work that contains aspects of each original work. In this case, Jane and Joe decide to combine the two paragraphs from the two authors that relate to the moments of transition in relation to the Gothic. The colors here are to help you see where the works of the two different authors are being used. Bowen's words are in blue and Hawkins's words are in green. Again, pause if you want, but I'll be moving on. They then further edit the paragraph for better transitions and clarity. This paragraph blends the words of the two authors in a way that makes it difficult to even know where one source ends and another begins. For academics, this part of the remixing process probably goes against years of training, carefully citing direct quotes. For some, this might even seem like plagiarism, but when remixing works in the Creative Commons, when the creators have given permission to adapt their works, that type of citation is virtually impossible if the remix is blended as much as it is here. In this case, Jane and Joe do this a few more times throughout the chapter they have titled Gothic in the early 20th century, and so they add an attribution to Bowen's alongside the attribution to Hawkins, making it clearer to the reader that this chapter is a remix. Now, happy with the materials they have found, Jane and Joe put the two chapters and one remixed chapter into a collection of supplemental materials for their super duper Gothic literature textbook. And of course, they are careful to include the appropriate Creative Commons license at the end of each chapter, including hyperlinks, making it easy for their users to find the original materials and explanations about the licenses themselves. Finally, they create their own Creative Commons license to share their collection with others. Exploring the intricacies of collections, adaptations, derivatives, and remixes in the Creative Commons highlights the power of Creative Commons licenses to facilitate the legal and ethical creation of shareable works. By respecting the original creator's intentions, innovation can thrive within a framework that benefits all.